Yes, I agree.
Check, 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 check.
Okay, and then we're going to, okay. I need to close out this next, I think. And then close out that. And then I need to find my desktop. Okay, so we'll just get rid of that. Oops, so this is it. There we go. Okay, so this goes into, well, I want to set it up for the slideshow. And this is the, now we need to, the slideshow. Working, okay. And that shows up on, what's this now?
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming this morning to learn a little bit about the history of, let's just call it our neighborhood, this area. We are so excited to have Jackie Mosio from the Highland Heritage Project, also a Katie alum here with us this morning to share some of the research and work that they've been doing with the Highland Heritage Project. Before we begin, just to remember, we are on Zoom, so there might be a few people on Zoom. We are also broadcasting it to the rooms so people can watch it in their rooms. And then we've had a number of residents who had appointments this morning, so we are going to record it as well. So on the CSJ YouTube channel, you can share the recording if people want to see it as well. Highland Heritage Project has asked if people would be willing just to sign that you're here this morning. It helps them to kind of know how many people are here, a little bit about you. And so there are 2 sign-up sheets going around. So if you wouldn't mind signing that, that would be great. Anise is a part of Highland Heritage Project as well. And so if you've got any questions afterwards, our hope this morning is we're going to spend about 40 minutes getting a presentation about this area from Jackie. And then we're going to open it up for the last 20 minutes kind of for a conversation, Q&A, and I'll come around with the mic on that. So hopefully Jackie can introduce herself more than I have, but I believe folks know her here at the village. But Jackie, let's just give Jackie a warm welcome to Carondelet Village.
Well, good morning and thank you very much. Can you hear okay on this? All right. Also, Anise Gregerson is here from Highland Heritage Project, and Judy Hildman and Susan Gangle. And the slideshow that you were seeing beforehand was put together by Susan. She's our archivist or our researcher and photographer par excellence. So let me make sure that I could probably hold this. Would you say it would be better? I can get it out. Good. All right. So here we are in Highland. But as we begin our talk, I'd like to share some thoughts with you. The recognition that we are on land cared for and belonging to Native peoples is reinforced by the study of our area's history and its complexities. Beyond the displacement from the land, it's important to recognize the impact of the loss on the culture, language, connections, and social structures of the First Peoples communities. Our Minnesota history, including Highlands history, is vast and multifaceted. It ranges from the people who originally made their home here to the fur traders making a living from exploiting animals for clothing and fashion in faraway urban centers, to refugees who came to this area escaping the effects of industrial capitalism in Europe. It includes the Native communities pushed eastward or pushed westward from their homes in the eastern parts of what became the United States, and the colonial settlers flocking here, both from the East Coast and from Europe. The knowledge and serious study of this history leaves us humbled in the face of all that has occurred and its continuing impacts. We also wish to state that as members of the Highland Heritage Project, we are Highland residents interested in preserving and sharing this valuable history. But we're not trained historians. We come from a range of backgrounds and contribute our talents to this effort for the benefit of our community. Speaking to you about Indigenous history and culture is an honor and a privilege, but I do not speak in place of Native voices. I merely wish to add my voice and experience to the growing desire to learn about, share this earth with, and be better relatives to our Native neighbors. I'd like to thank Marty Rohrs for the invitation to speak to you. And I acknowledge the concern of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet regarding the history of the land where their contribution to St. Paul rests. Here we go. Regarding any new information about the land that St. Catharines is on, I have nothing new to report. But that doesn't mean that further research won't reveal anything. The Ramsey County Recorder's Office computers are unavailable for a few weeks, but at a future date, we'll see what we can find. Meanwhile, what we can do is provide a larger context for the usurping, the exploitation, and the use of native lands, and also look at the first peoples who lived and continue to live nearby. Studying the past facilitates seeing the interconnections, ties, and the magnitude of what happened here as Minnesota came to be what it is. This knowledge creates a sense of responsibility and awareness. Our region's past is filled with pain for some, benefits for others, struggles to survive, cooperation, exploitation, cruelty, kindness, wisdom, and folly. The better we remember and acknowledge this, the closer we are to the truth of our existence. Hopefully, that truth will set us free from ignorance, disdain, and disrespect for others, and false, dangerous feelings of superiority. Just briefly, I want to mention how Highland Heritage Project originated. Plans for the decommissioning and demolition of the Ford plant became known in the early 2000s. Lumen Christi Catholic Community, the church nearest to the site, held a forum for residents in December of 2014, where we looked at our Highland neighborhood and talked about the community's values and the vision for the future. We began organizing a community initiative to provide information, and in 2017, we launched Highland Heritage Project in order to document local history. We received a Legacy Amendment grant through Minnesota Historical Society in 2020 to carry out research that we had already begun. And we have just received 2 more grants to write up the results of our research and create a documentary on the Jewish-Christian cooperation that characterizes Highland and was essential to its mid-20th century development. So this is Bedote. Oops, I think I skipped the page here. So our region, where are we? So a little bit of background. As I mentioned, Highland history and the history of this part of the country is complex and vast, as is all of U.S. history. But it is a key area, especially because here occurred the establishment of Fort Snelling at the confluence of the Mississippi River and the Minnesota River, called the Saint-Pierre by the Canadian French fur traders. This confluence, known as Bedote by the Dakota living here, is a sacred origin site for them. The Dakota had lived here for centuries. They knew the rivers and lakes, the forests, the animals and fish of the waters. There were a number of villages. Kaposia, near downtown St. Paul on the east side of the river, which had to move to the current South St. Paul after the Dakota lost the lands on the east of the Mississippi, was one nearby. Little Crow's Village, Chaska, and others dotted the region. On the white map, 2 fur trading companies appear, the Columbia Fur Company and the American Fur Company. The last one was owned by John Jacob Astor, who then bought out its competitor, the Columbia Fur Company. The fur trade was a major social and economic force for several centuries. And I don't know if you can see the green circles, the Dakota Village, and also a mission. It's a whole other story about the missionaries. There's a Dakota Village circled in blue, another one circled with yellow, further on south. But you'll see there were a lot of Dakota villages in the area. Summer camps were set up for hunting, fishing, and foraging for food and medicinal plants. Cultivation might take place around the village or at the summer campsites. Hunting areas, such as Little Canada, would also be visited. Now, this is an interesting map. This map shows the early roads that became West 7th, that's the black arrow, and Snelling, the red arrow. That one actually goes out to Little Canada. These roads were the original trails established by Native people living here as they went from village to village, or to the river, or to sacred sites, such as Pilot Knob, Ohiyawahe, meaning a place much visited, and probably a cemetery for them. Pilot Knob's history and the efforts to preserve it. Early on, it was proposed as the site of the state capitol building, reveal much about the character of the land's new settlers. So you can see those paths on that. And another interesting map from the past. French Canadian traders usually settled with Native women at villages along the trade routes, wherever fur trading took place. But the Bedoti area and Highland was one of the first areas where non-natives settled. The first settlers were primarily Scottish and Swiss families that came down from the Red River, Selkirk colony in southern Canada. The area they settled on, which is actually near Elsie Lane, between Cleveland Avenue and the River Road, in contemporary Highland, is just above the access road to the Mississippi River at Hidden Falls. The original name for the settlement in St. Paul, or in Highland rather, was Rumtown. So you see the kind of olive colored arrow points to Rumtown. Across the river is Camp Coldwater with the red arrow. Camp Coldwater was used by the soldiers who were building the fort. The 1839 map, which this is key because officials at the fort decided to run those settlers off the land, in part because of the production and sale of alcohol to the soldiers and natives, and the future potential value of the reserved area land. Some accounts say this happened in 1839, while others give 1840 as the date the dwellings were burned and people forced to move beyond the 9-mile reserve of the fort. According to one account, Pierre Pig's Eye Perrant, a French Canadian fur trader turned alcohol seller, was part of this group. The eviction sent these entrepreneurs and settlers further downriver to establish what later became St. Paul. We all know that it was Lucien Galtier who rescued us from being called Pig's Eye, but the original name for the Dakota name for St. Paul is very poetic. Iminisa Ska, which means white cliffs, the white cliffs of the bluffs that we see downtown. So Camp Coldwater at the red arrow there, across the river by Coldwater Spring, also had residents, and apparently they were evicted as well. Some, the ferry master for one, managed to stay in his home on the reserve. And eventually, as more and more settlers came to the region, the reserve did have people living within the 9-mile radius. In this 1867 map, we see what is known as the Reserve Township, and that wasn't incorporated into the city of St. Paul until 1887, 20 years after this map. The 1867 map shows those who claimed the lands. Some were speculators, while others farmed the land. When the settlers who actually lived on the land heard it was for sale, they agreed to band together, all wearing red shirts, and not let speculators outbid them for the land they lived and worked on. This is the same map, but with the street names. Cleveland with the red arrow, Cleveland is named after Horace Cleveland, to whom we owe our park system, a wonderful man, and I think he's our patron saint for this project. Snelling, the green, which goes out to Little Canada, and West 7th in gold, now Old Fort Road. That is the oldest road in the area. Anybody who came to the fort by land used this road, then crossed the river by one of the ferries operating on the rivers. But now let's take a step back to briefly review the takeover of this large Midwest territory. And we have to remember that this whole area functioned as a unit. It was a social, cultural, and economic unit. Much of it had originally been part of the Northwest Territory, which was the land ceded by Britain in 1783. The Louisiana Purchase occurred in 1803. All this land was opening up to eager settler colonizers, and this created traumatic pressures for the original peoples living here, and came into play, especially in the struggle over slavery in the North. From 1836 until Wisconsin's statehood in 1848, the Wisconsin Territory included Minnesota and part of the Dakotas. Minnesota didn't become a state until 1858. This region was home to various native tribes who had interconnections and ties among them. Basically, we know that the fur traders and missionaries who first came in the late 1600s used the pathways and knowledge of the Native Americans for their routes and forays across the area. You know, so many accounts say, oh, this famous whatever, white explorer discovered this river, lake, whatever. No, they were shown these features and taken there by native guides. In 1787, slavery had been prohibited in the Northwest Territory by the Northwest Ordinance. The practice and economic impact of slavery was an enormous factor in U.S. history. When we take time to look back at slavery's role in the United States and the reactions to it, we can better understand our present configurations. It's another thread of history that our region played a role in, and that deserves its own study and really deserves to be gone into and to really understand all the connections. It's really hard to grasp the dramatic increase in population and its impact. The estimate is that there were around 30,000 Native Americans at the time of the Minnesota Territory, which was 1848. The white population at the time of 5,000 included many mixed families that were counted as white. When the Wisconsin census was taken in 1850, its population had nearly tripled to 304,456. Minnesota in 1850 had a little over 6,000. However, by 1858, its population had grown to 150,000. It's important to keep in mind the impact of the tremendous pressure that the exploding population put on the many Native groups in the area and on the environment. All this is the early background for our research into Highland Park in St. Paul, where Fort Snelling was built around the 1820s, then the Ford plant in the 1920s, and now there is a large residential area, and it's filling the 122 acres that was occupied by the Ford plant. So, what was happening in the 1700s and 1800s in our region? Water, land, animals, trees, and vegetation are an intrinsic part of the story of Native Americans here. The Dakota peoples were the main large group in Minnesota, with the Ojibwe to the north. Two factors to keep in mind. The buildup of population pressures on the East Coast from colonialist settlements pushed Native Americans ever westward, and the profitable fur trade sent explorers and traders into this area. After the French were defeated, exploration and westward expansion into Indian territory increased with the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. French claimed land west of the Mississippi became part of the United States, encouraging exploration and more encroachment into native territory. The impact on our region, in 1805, Zebulon Pike searched for and decided on the bluff overlooking the junction of the Minnesota, St. Pierre, and Mississippi rivers as a site for a fort where American fur trade could be protected and the Native American population monitored and controlled. What you're seeing on the screen is the entire treaty. Pike valued the land at $200,000 in his own writings, but the treaty specifies $2,000, which was not even fully paid. During the years of the fort's construction, soldiers lived at Camp Coldwater near the Coldwater Spring across the river, which I mentioned, and the fort was built, it completed in 1825. Fur traders had been coming mainly from French Canada following the rivers since the late 1600s. Among Native Americans, intermarriage was a common way to establish and consolidate relations with other tribes. This was also the practice with the French fur traders who were accepted into native tribes, worked with them in trapping and preparing furs, and established families. Conflict developed between the French and the British for the control of land and the fur trade. The fur trade continued for another 3 decades, but eventually died out as silk replaced beaver for men's hats, and the beaver population declined. This disrupted existing social and commercial systems, causing greater dependence by Native Americans on the funds due them for giving up their access to and use of vast stretches of land through the treaties they were obligated to sign. What we have to remember is that Native American communities, Dakota and Ojibwe, were working out social, economic, and political relations with the British fur traders, the Canadians, the Métis, the mixed families, and the American interests. This is obviously a posed photo, but this Rose Brothers Fur Company is an example, and they were located on East 5th Street in St. Paul. When we look at the several century contact period, we see Native communities responding to new arrivals with curiosity and acceptance, and in many cases, enabling their survival. This was the case with the Selkirk colony in northern Minnesota and Canada, also known as the Red River Colony. Landless Scottish and Swiss farmers were brought to Canada with the idea of setting up a colony. This was the idea of Lord Selkirk, who was probably a very compassionate person, at least with regard to the people, to what he was witnessing in Europe. He didn't really, I haven't discovered that he talked about the impact of this on the natives of the area. So but the conditions, though, in Canada were so severe that the people would not have survived if the local tribes and the Métis had not taken them in. Large numbers of settlers eventually abandoned the area due to the harsh conditions and crop failures. And they migrated to Fort Snelling and Highland, Rumtown, as we saw above. Many continued east to Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana, but other families stayed and became early settlers in the region. Let's see here. Oops. Let me go this way. Here we go. These are the ox carts that would lumber into the city, having traveled 600 miles from the north. And there are many accounts of the creaking sound of these, the wood on wood, as they would go through the streets. And Pembina was the town up in the north where there was this another fur trading post and central location. The economic and social impact of trading and the interaction with the French Canadians cannot be underestimated. The St. Peter Cemetery in Mendota contains many tombstones with French names, and Little Canada was settled by Métis families. Oopsie. The building of the fort in the 1820s and the influx of land-hungry settlers to the area around the fort began an intense period of treaty making that resulted in eventually stripping the resident native peoples of great portions of land and subjecting them to a way of life that deprived them of the land base they needed to survive and making them dependent on government payouts and food supplies. The policies around this led directly to the conditions of the 1862 Dakota Uprising and their subsequent banishment. As an illustration of the deteriorating conditions for Native peoples, let's look at a basic human interaction: marriage. Marriage had deep social functions for Native groups. It created social obligations, defined relationships between people and groups, but new arrivals, soldiers and settlers, abused and ignored marriage customs and imposed their own abusive and exploitative behaviors. Soldiers purchased Native women. Economic dependency became a factor. The social order established among the first peoples and maintained with the French Canadian traders disintegrated. Concerning the treaties used to deprive Native peoples of their lands, most, if not all, have been broken and used against the Native signers' communities. These maps give some idea of the vast reduction of territory of the Native peoples were subject to. Besides incessant relocation and limitation, entire groups were often moved repeatedly across a region, a state, or several states. And this is the Minnesota chart. So you see that very little was left for them. There's a little part along the Minnesota River that they were reduced to, and some of the other areas. There were some proposals in the 1800s that were made because it was obvious that Native communities were not going to survive under the steady pressure to eliminate them and their base of subsistence. Wisconsin's territorial governor proposed making all Dakota lands in Minnesota home for all the tribes of the Northwest, and no whites would be allowed. The idea envisioned that they become assimilated, participate in government. This talk could have lulled some of the communities into thinking they had a future, but these proposals were rejected and the treaties and land taking proceeded. So James Doty was the governor of Wisconsin. And of course, he chose Minnesota as the spot to send everybody to. But even though these ideas were talked about, nothing really came of them. So this area then became farmland, and Irish, German, and other immigrants began to flood westward in search of land. This photo shows the Davern family. We recognize the name. And this is the farmland in what is now urban Highland, precisely the area of Highland Park High School and the golf course. The U.S. Dakota War, or the Dakota Uprising of 1862, was one that should never have happened, but yet was inevitable. It was a second civil war, localized and shorter, but definitive for the country and disastrous for the Dakota. and by extension, for all Native Americans. It deserves far more than this brief mention here. But there are two main facts to remember about it. The first is that Native Americans, having been throttled into smaller and smaller places and denied their sources of sustenance in the forests and plains, were deprived, conceivably on purpose, of the rations they were promised in exchange for the land they were obligated to cede to white colonizers. The other key fact is that the holding camp below the bluffs on the river signaled the forced removal of the Dakota from the territory. This was a brutal rupture for the Dakotas, who were forced into exile. We know that 40 men were punished for involvement. 38 were hanged at one time in the uprising. At least one Native who protected a white family was also hung because he had the same name as someone else, Chaska. Exile of the Dakota was demanded, as the intention was to eliminate all Dakota from Minnesota. The connection between the many deaths on both sides and the exile of the Dakota and the creation and expansion of our way of life in Minnesota, surrounded by so many Native places and place names, is painfully obvious. It is valid and necessary to be concerned about the land that individuals and institutions have prospered on and profited from. So we did some research, but this has not come to fruition yet. But I did want to mention this interesting thing that showed up as we were doing research. Our still incomplete research about land in Highland, and in particular St. Kate's, turned up something odd in our view. In the plat book, used probably into the 1940s, we see the real estate developer, Danny Lane, at work. His story is interesting and for another day. Upper and Lower St. Denis are named for his patron saint. But did he have designs on St. Catherine's property? There's the announcement in the upper right of Denny Lane's Cleveland villas. And the plat book, they pasted in indications onto the land belonging to St. Kate's. Curious. You'll see Bayard Avenue is pointed out in red on the two. And also Prior Street is circled. So you see, it looks like they were going to just say, oh, we get this part of St. Kate's. We have to investigate that. Land is the base for development on the earth, as the concept and story of this continent shows. So many cultures carry a story of a great flood that wiped out much of life. In the Native American versions, life is saved and built up again on the back of a turtle, thus Turtle Island. There's the land, yes, but there is also the cultural, moral, and spiritual life of those living on it. Let's take some time to explore Native thought, to become aware of how a different worldview underlies a radically different approach to life, to the earth, and to the experience of living on it. The way life, others, and the earth are viewed forms our relationships. The Dakota expression, all our relatives, is a statement of that reality. To approach what might have been the underlying pervasive worldview before the encroachment of Western mentality, Christian concepts, and the capitalist foundation brought by those who immigrated to the continents of the New World, I am turning to my previous work with Dr. Sylvia Marcos, Mexican anthropologist, psychologist, activist, and feminist scholar. Through her study of ancient pre-Columbian and conquest texts, the codices, she has illumined some of the key concepts of this very complex and intricate philosophy. She tells about a gardener from a Nahuatl, which is the original language of the Aztecs, the Nahuatl-speaking region, who was working in her garden. She told him to throw the dirt from a planter into the garbage bin. He answered with a shocked but polite, "No, no, señora. Soil shouldn't be treated like garbage." Another time, an indigenous woman helping her at home reacted to Sylvia's complaint about dirt and dust blowing into the house and said, "Señora, you shouldn't speak like that of dirt because it is soil, and soil is our mother, la madre tierra, who nurtures us." The Mesoamerican views of the earth and soil contrast with a concept of soil and dirt as inert matter that can be discarded like refuse or complained about like an intrusive pollutant. In our mutual effort and desire to comprehend our responsibility in this contemporary world and to understand the forces at play, we would be wise to take a larger, more expansive view by approaching the thinking or cosmovision and spirituality of the people we call Native. Unfortunately, much of that understanding has been filtered through a male Eurocentric mindset formed by Western patriarchal and dualistic modes of thought, which often condemned perceived features of the cultures they encountered as the work of the devil and consequently banished it. When we look for information about Native spirituality, we must focus on the subjective being in space experience. My work with Sylvia Marcos has given me tools to understand this other worldview so different from ours. She could do a much better job sharing this knowledge with you, but I will try to convey some of the concepts that might give you a glimpse of another way to perceive and connect with the world. The black and white photos I'm sharing as I speak of this are from Nahuatl-speaking villages in Mexico, whose inhabitants practice a blend of their ancient traditions and the imposed Spanish Catholicism. These are my photos from the 1980s when I was invited to visit the villages. I don't know if you can see, but curiously, there's a cross, the base of the cross, and you see little white things. Those are eggs hung in a net on there. I don't recall that that's a Catholic practice. And there are many other features like that that I would notice when I would visit the villages. So they're bringing forward their time-honored ancient ways of honoring the earth and bringing it into what the Spanish version of Catholicism taught them. The world is seen as alive, in constant fluid change. Harmony and balance are important values, and that harmony depends on human actions and thought. The pre-Columbian world was perceived as filled and governed by forces, gods and goddesses, but underlying that was a more complete and open perception that instinctively comprehends the interrelationship of all things. The wind, Hecatl, is a recognized force or entity. The Nahuatl phrase meaning God of near and far was meaningful to me when I lived in Mexico. Although there is duality, hot, cold, male, female, up, down, growth, decay, and these might seem opposite poles, reality is perceived to be on a continuum characterized by a continuous shifting and fluid movement. Homeoteotl is in essence to God, combining opposites. Homeoteotl is the term used for the supreme God in Nahuatl, and is conceived of as a mother, father, dual protector, and creator. Behavior had to be such that balance was preserved, and this was a collective obligation. Appropriate behavior while living one's life and enjoying the pleasures of earth was necessary to maintain the cosmic order. And I'm going to quote Sylvia on this because she says it precisely. Equilibrium, as conceived in indigenous spirituality, is not the static repose of two equal weights or masses. Rather, it is a force that constantly modifies the relationship between the dual or opposite pairs. We can see that these ideas collide with our Western categorical dualistic way of thinking. Some questions. Is there a way of perception that is authentic and not mediated by mental concepts? Is this way closer to a mystic's perception of reality? Is there something in our worldview that doesn't allow us to perceive the subtle filaments and whispers of connections with the earth, the sky, and doesn't hear the voice of water? And another quote from Sylvia. For indigenous peoples, the world is not out there, established outside of and apart from them. It is within them and even through them. Actions and their circumstances are much more interwoven than is the case in Western thought, in which the I can be abstracted from its surroundings. Furthermore, the body's porosity reflects the essential porosity of the cosmos, a permeability of the entire material world that defines an order of existence characterized by a continuous interchange between the material and the immaterial. That's heavy duty cosmology. Enjoy it, taste it. And then, I don't know how much of the Dakota, Ojibwe, or other North American worldview can be inferred from Mesoamerican cosmology. But in my experience, it offers an entry point to a profoundly different understanding of the world. Let's recall all our relatives and note the relation of the Mesoamerican concept of a cosmos where everything is connected, in constant motion, and interdependent. Maybe that is how the Native Americans in our area essentially perceive the world. And here are some wisdom thoughts from the Omaha and the Shawnee. Ask questions from your heart and you will be answered from the heart. We are all one child spinning to the sky, sense of all being one. Here we are back again at Bedote. What happened to the exiled Native Americans? Some of the Dakota returned to Minnesota, but their numbers were greatly reduced. Some managed to stay here. The site of the holding camp, also regarded as a concentration camp, is now a sacred site. Can we ever learn fully enough to understand the impact of these colliding and competing forces? The Native American process of collective awareness as a basis for decision and action was challenged by the relentless individualism of the newcomers and the insatiable need for more and more land as settler colonists flooded into the region. The Mdewakanton Dakota tribal group in Mendota, here in present day, traces back to the Native people who worked and built families with the fur traders, dealt with the soldiers at Fort Snelling, and the people flooding into the region. They petitioned for federal tribal recognition, but because of intermarriage with fur traders and the reluctance to join other Dakota groups during the uprising, they were never recognized as an official tribe by the government. Descendants of the Mendota area Native Americans and fur traders are adamant about preserving their history and connection to this area. Over 25 years ago, they began holding Wachipi powwows every September on land they have been associated with, St. Peter's in Mendota. Today, in part due to the hard work, openness, and generosity of Native American groups locally. We can learn from and learn about and share with them the importance of Native sites, language, food, and even participate in a local sweat lodge ceremony, the Inipi. The tribal group is very welcoming and willing to share practices and create community. And in fact, they now have, in part thanks to partnership with Lumen Christi Church, they have an office in Mendota where they will be teaching crafts, language, and their culture. This is the site, which is in back of the Dupuy House along Highway 13 in Mendota. And this is the sweat lodge, and the stones are being heated and prepared. My experience of the sweat lodge was extraordinary. The heat, dark, and sweat confronts us with our bodies. The rounds of prayers and invocations connect us with ancestors and each other. Then, lying on the ground outside afterwards, as a gentle rain fell on me, I was profoundly aware of my connection to the elements of water, earth, air, and nature around me. And during the shared meal afterward, I realized how freeing it was to shed the false veneer we develop in our society. And I felt invited to be direct and real. You know, we can't undo the past, but we can recognize its impact, learn what has been kept from us, and establish meaningful relations with all our relatives. Professor Chris Matonunpa, who is from the Yellow Medicine area reservation, gave a presentation on the 1805 treaty recently at Lake Hiawatha Community Center, and he speaks frequently about Native issues. There was a Dakota gathering in Omnichie at Fort Snelling a week ago, and a niece and I went. We participated in a Native zodiac presentation by astronomer Jim Rock, using multiple elements to teach about the Earth, Sun, and planets. And there was also a talk and documentary film about Charles Eastman Oyesa. This was given by his relatives. And I don't, if you know, I'm sure many of you know the name Charles Eastman, who was, he escaped when in 1862, went up to Canada, lived as a Native American with his grandmother until he was 15, when his father, who had survived the exile and the war, came and got him and insisted that he learn the American ways. And then he went on to become a doctor and a very famous person as far as his writing and speaking. And so what Sidney Bean, who was the gentleman there, he made a film on the soul of an Indian. And he also worked on this manuscript. This was a manuscript that Eastman had never published, but it's the creation of the legend of the Dakota creation story. So these are available, and there's the woman in the middle. We spoke with her. She's 91, and also a relative of this extended family that Charles Eastman had. So there are some Indigenous organizations to be aware of and to support and even partner with. For our part, we will continue to do research into St. Catherine's land background. We promise to share the results with you. And because we have benefited from the Dear Neighbor Mapping Prejudice Project, and we include the results of that research in our other presentations. So our history here in Highland touches on so much. We don't really think of this area as pivotal. It's just a pleasant urban enclave, but probing our history reveals crucial ties to the texture of our region, state, and country, and reveals that we have much to learn and share with others. thank you so much for this opportunity. As you get to know, well, wait a minute. As you get to know Native Americans, you realize that they have this encompassing sense summed up in the phrase, all are our relatives, which includes the earth and all its inhabitants, plants and animals, as well as the humans. So thank you. And if you have any questions, if you'd like.
So I'll come around with the microphone if anyone has a comment, thought, question you'd like to share. Just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Can I ask sorry, I have a question about the source materials used for all of this research and like where you found all of this information.
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are books such as Minnesota Makoche, the Land of the Dakota. And there's been a lot of really great work done recently. I think Anise has brought our all-time favorite book. Oh, you didn't, then North Country by Mary Wingard. And there are so many other books. And there are classes on the treaties, Essential Charles Eastman. And there's also layers and layers and layers. I mean, what people have done is gone into the original accounts, to the old history books, the records, the files, the collections. So yes, we definitely rely on all of that. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a question here.
I hope I'm not over promising, but we do have a annotated bibliography that we prepared actually over several years. And so it's not as updated. Somehow within the last 3 months, I would say Jackie Mosio has done the deepest dive because Judy Hildman up here in the front row with me, we're part of the team with Susan who did all these slides. Jackie does her thing too. However, Judy and I used to present a very elemental presentation. Today, y'all got the whopper. I mean, this is incredible work that's been done over a long period of time and going places, networking, attending conventions or gatherings. It was just, we happened upon what Jackie knew about it. Local history, Minnesota Historical Society sends out, if you get on that website, and it opens the doors to whatever's going on in our area or our state. But so just leave or come forward. I know we're going to be bounced from the room, so perhaps y'all want to do it outside the door because we want to make this room available for the anointing. There's another question.
This is a little off the subject, but how does the word Lakota and Dakota join together?
Oh, that's wonderful. And actually the gentleman, Chris Matu Nunpa, said it's just a verbal variation. It's as if, the Puerto Ricans use an L instead of an R. So you say Puerto Rico. It's a little bit like that. It's just the L and the D are switched for the Lakota. And there are some differences in language, but they tease each other. He told me that some of their jokes to each other about the language differences, but that's basically what it is. It's a different, they're farther into South Dakota area, and the Dakota are here in the Minnesota area, or that was their origin. Good question.
I don't have a question. I have a request. This is so good. I think it should be professionally done and then shown at the Highland Theater for everybody.
Oh,
and you will be swarmed, I'm sure.
That is so sweet. Thank you very much for encouraging us. Yes, as I say, we're working on, but you know, the thing to get a documentary together is like a lot of work. But we would love to do that. We actually have another short documentary done by Peter Meyer, and it's about Sibley Manor. I mean, we could have a whole day of film at Highland Theater.
I would like it if this annotated bibliography, if you would send it to Marty, and Marty would put it on our new thing called Wellzestra, so that we could all have access to these books and information. And I think you should come back and tell us more and more and more. This to me seems just a very beginning.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, well, for the sake of time, I know we have anointing service that's going to happen in this room at 11:45. So we promised the liturgy folks that we would try and end at 11:30 to give the chance for transition. But a couple of quick things. We'll definitely invite Annalise and Jackie and the Highland Heritage Project and all of them to come back and share. Secondly, keep in mind, if you are interested, Carnolet Village Justice Seekers, together with the Sisters of St. Joseph Justice Office, is sponsoring a Sacred Sites tour. So that's on June the 7th. We'll leave after Mass on that Wednesday. We'll gather in the front space at 10:30. We will bring a picnic lunch, and we'll be back hopefully between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. We'll go to 3 sacred sites that Jackie has talked about today. We'll be going to St. Peter's in Mendota. We'll be going to Fort Snelling and the site of the concentration camp there for the Dakota during the war. And then we'll be going to Pilot Knob. The tour will be led by Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs. He does this as a part of the Healing Minnesota Stories. Anyone is welcome to come. If you have a walker or a wheelchair as well, we have the Carondelet Village bus. So we need people to sign up, and we are hoping that we will have enough people to help us with carpooling so we can save on the environment in that, but also go together. So Jackie just gave us a teaser of what hopefully we'll experience in person on that day. So again, that's June the 7th. And then we are inviting St. Catherine's University to come on July the 12th, which is another Wednesday after the 4th of July. And professors from St. Catherine's University will come and share about the racial covenants in Ramsey County. So they've been doing this project called the Dear Neighbor Project. And so they've been mapping prejudice, mapping the area. And so they're going to come and not only update about the research, but the particular professor who's going to lead this talk is one of their English professors, and they've been collecting stories from Ramsey County. So July the 7th. So look for flyers in the elevator. We're inviting folks to come up and talk with Jackie or the folks from the Highland Heritage Project. Again, we're going to try and transition for folks who are coming in for the anointing as well. But let's give Jackie just a round of applause, and we hope she'll come back.
Yes, I also just wanted to quickly say that when we first started this project back in 2014, yeah, one of the first invitations I did was to invite Professor Chris Matonunpa and his wife, who happened to be a classmate of mine, to meet so we could begin this connection with our Native Americans, because it seemed to me that we were deprived of that, our normal human connection with our history and with the people who are around us. And this should not be a one-off thing. It should be something that we are really incorporating into our everyday awareness in life and have good relations with our neighbors. Thank you so much for having me speak.
We can share too. They have a new, kind of email service in the building that we can share. There's no just.